Well, look who it is! Little Luke Jr. himself! Keep your head down where it belongs, kid.
The trajectory of Frank Luke Jr., from the sun-bleached expanse of the Arizona Territory to the muddy, flak-torn skies of the Western Front, is a study in contrasts, forged by the unique pressures of early 20th century warfare. Born on May 19, 1897, in Phoenix, Luke entered a world that was still largely untamed. Arizona was 15 years away from statehood, a rugged landscape that demanded physical resilience and self-reliance. This environment imprinted itself upon Luke's psychological profile. He was the fifth of 9 children in a household established by Frank Luke Sr., a German immigrant who had arrived in the American West in 1874. Luke's early life was characterized by a distinct restlessness and a predilection for high-stakes physical confrontation. He was not a contemplative academic. He was a creature of kinetic energy. Anecdotal evidence from his youth in Phoenix depicts a young man who sought out the hardest labor and the roughest sports. He worked in the copper mines, a grueling, dangerous vocation that built physical strength and a tolerance for hazardous environments. At Phoenix Union High School, he excelled as the captain of the track team and a varsity football player, known for an aggressive style of play that bordered on reckless. He engaged in bare-knuckle boxing matches, a sport that rewarded quick reflexes, the ability to absorb pain, and the killer instinct to exploit an opponent's weakness, traits that would later translate directly to the cockpit of a fighter plane. When the United States entered the Great War in April 1917, the nation faced a logistical and technological chasm. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, which oversaw aviation, possessed only a handful of obsolete aircraft and a few dozen trained pilots. Luke enlisted on September 25, 1917, diving into a training pipeline that was being invented in real time. His initial ground training at the University of Texas School of Military Aeronautics provided the theoretical framework of flight, but it was at Rockwell Field in San Diego that he first took to the air. The aircraft of the era were fragile constructs of wood, wire, and doped linen, powered by rotary or inline engines that were notoriously temperamental. Learning to fly in 1917 was as much about mechanical management as it was about aerodynamics. Luke, with his miner's hands and athlete's coordination, took to the controls with an intuitive grasp. He earned his commission as a second lieutenant in January 1918, a rapid ascent that placed him among the vanguard of American air power. However, the transition to the European theater revealed a deep cultural schism within the air service. The pilot corps was dominated by the sons of the Eastern elite, men from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton who viewed the war as a chivalric extension of collegiate sports. Luke, the rough-hewn Westerner with a German surname and a lack of social polish, was an outlier. He did not fit the mold of the gentleman pilot. He was solitary, intense, and uninterested in the social hierarchies of the officers' mess. Upon his arrival in France, Luke was sent to the 3rd Aviation Instruction Center at Issoudun. This massive complex was the finishing school for American fighter pilots. Here, they transitioned to the combat aircraft that defined the war, the Nieuport 28 and the SPAD XIII. The SPAD XIII, which would become Luke's chariot of choice, was a formidable machine. Powered by a 220-horsepower Hispano-Suiza 8BE engine, it was capable of speeds up to 135 km/h, fast for its day. It carried 2 synchronized Nar-caliber Vickers machine guns mounted on the cowling. Unlike the nimble rotary-engined fighters, the SPAD was heavy and robust. It dived like a stone, allowing pilots to slash through enemy formations and escape using energy tactics. It was a machine designed for violence, not grace, and it suited Luke perfectly. Luke was assigned to the 27th Aero Squadron, the Fighting Eagles, commanded by Major Harold E. Hartney. The squadron was part of the 1st Pursuit Group, operating in the Aisne-Marne sector. From the moment he arrived, Luke rubbed his fellow pilots the wrong way. He was perceived as arrogant, boastful, and undisciplined. He ignored formation protocols, often breaking away to hunt alone, a cardinal sin in a service that emphasized teamwork. His first aerial combat occurred on August 16, 1918. Flying a lone patrol, a violation of orders, he engaged a German formation and claimed to have shot down an enemy aircraft. However, he lacked the corroborating witnesses required by the rigid confirmation system of the air service. His claim was dismissed, and his squadron mates openly mocked him, labeling him the Arizona Boaster. This rejection was a pivotal moment. It drove Luke further into isolation and fueled a burning desire to prove his worth through undeniable acts of destruction. He realized that to silence his critics, he needed targets that left no ambiguity. He needed to burn the German observation balloons. The timeline of Frank Luke's life narrows to a razor's edge on Sunday, September 29, 1918. The atmosphere at the Rembercourt Aerodrome was thick with tension, not just from the proximity of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but from the internal war raging between Second Lieutenant Luke and his commanding officer, Captain Alfred Grant. That morning, Luke had returned to base after an unauthorized overnight stay at a French airfield. He had spent the previous day, September 28th, destroying 2 German aircraft and a balloon, but his failure to return to his unit was the final straw for Captain Grant. Grant, a rigid disciplinarian who viewed Luke's freelance tactics as a threat to squadron cohesion, met him on the flight line with a fury that matched the roar of the engines. He grounded Luke on the spot. The order was absolute. Luke was under arrest and forbidden from flying. For a pilot like Luke, whose entire psychological stability was now tethered to the adrenaline of combat, this confinement was intolerable. The war was reaching a crescendo a few miles to the north, and he was being chained to the ground by paperwork and protocol. In a brazen act of defiance that would have resulted in a court-martial had he survived, Luke simply walked away from the confrontation, climbed into his SPAD XIII, and took off. He did not fly toward the enemy immediately. Instead, he turned his nose toward the forward aerodrome at Verdun, where the group commander, Major Harold Hartney, was stationed. Hartney was a different breed of officer than Grant. He understood that in the calculus of war, results often outweighed regulations. He had seen the devastation Luke had wrought on the German balloon lines, 14 balloons and 4 planes in under 2 weeks. He knew that the American infantry, slogging through the mud of the Meuse-Argonne, were being hammered by German artillery directed by those very balloons. When Luke landed at Verdun, he was technically a fugitive from military justice. He found Hartney and pleaded his case. He didn't ask for clemency, he asked for a target. He had spotted 3 German observation balloons in the Dun-sur-Meuse sector, positioned to overlook the American advance. He wanted to take them out. Hartney, looking at the exhausted, intense young pilot, made a command decision. He tacitly countermanded Grant's arrest order. He told Luke to go get them. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon, casting the long, deep shadows across the cratered landscape of the front. This was Luke's preferred hunting time. The gloaming, that transitional light between day and dusk, offered a tactical advantage. The muzzle flashes of the German anti-aircraft guns would be visible against the darkening ground, allowing him to dodge the tracers, while his own aircraft would be a dark silhouette against the dark earth to the German fighters above. Luke walked to his machine. The ground crews at Verdun fueled the SPAD and loaded, the twin Vickers guns with 11mm incendiary ammunition, the balloon-busting rounds designed to ignite hydrogen gas. As the engine coughed to life, spinning the propeller into a blur, Luke prepared for a mission that he likely knew was a one-way trip. The Germans had put a price on his head. They had reinforced the balloon defenses specifically to trap him. Before he taxied out, Luke performed a final, deliberate action. He took a message canister, a small metal tube with a weighted streamer attached, and scribbled a note. This was not a letter to his mother in Phoenix, nor a final testament. It was a tactical declaration to the American balloon observers at the 7th Balloon Company in Suicidal. He placed the note in the canister and stowed it in the cockpit. He gunned the engine, the Hispano-Suiza roaring a challenge. The SPAD bounced over the rough turf of the Verdun field and lifted into the gray sky. He stayed low, skimming the treetops. As he passed over the American balloon headquarters at Souilly, he leaned out of the cockpit and threw the canister. It tumbled down, the streamer unfurling to catch the wind. The soldiers on the ground retrieved it. They unscrewed the cap and read the handwritten scrawl. "Watch for burning balloons. Lieutenant Luke." It was 6:58 p.m. Frank Luke banked his aircraft toward the Meuse River. Ahead of him lay the German lines, a wall of steel and fire. He was alone. The sky was darkening. He pushed the throttle forward and disappeared into the smoke. To understand the lethality of Frank Luke's final flight, we must rewind to mid-September 1918 and examine the tactical revolution he pioneered. The target of his obsession, the Drachen balloon, was the cornerstone of the German defensive system. These sausage-shaped hydrogen dirigibles tethered at 2,000 to 3,000 feet provided observers with a panoramic view of the Allied lines. They could spot troop concentrations, supply trucks, and artillery flashes, relaying coordinates to German batteries that would obliterate the targets within minutes. Because of their immense value, the balloons were the most heavily defended objects in the sky. A typical balloon site was surrounded by a flak trap. At the base, heavy machine guns were positioned in a circle to create a cone of fire. Interspersed with these were the dreaded flaming onions, 37 mm revolving cannons that fired strings of 5 glowing green incendiary shells. These shells did not just rely on impact. They were designed to terrify and disorient pilots, creating a visual net of fire. Higher up, heavier anti-aircraft artillery, Archie, was pre-ranged to the balloon's altitude, creating a kill box that a pilot had to fly through to bring his guns to bear. Attacking a balloon was widely considered suicide. The standard tactic was to dive from high altitude, fire a quick burst, and pull away before the ground fire could bracket the aircraft. But this often failed. The balloons were massive, but the gas bags were compartmentalized, and standard bullets often passed through without igniting the hydrogen. To ensure a kill, a pilot had to use incendiary ammunition and get close, point-blank range, often within 50 yards of the target. Frank Luke looked at this tactical problem and discarded the caution that kept other pilots alive. He realized that the German defenses relied on visual tracking. He proposed attacking at dusk, when the light compromised the German gunner's aim, and the German fighter patrols were returning to base. But Luke did not act entirely alone in the beginning. He found a partner in Lieutenant Joseph Frank Wehner. Wehner was, like Luke, an outcast. Also of German heritage, Wehner had been suspected of being a spy, ostracized by the squadron, and investigated by the Secret Service. The shared isolation forged a bond between the two men that was stronger than friendship. It was a pact of survival. They developed a hawk and dove tactic. Wehner would fly high cover, watching for the German Fokker-Decient fighters that lurked in the clouds protecting the balloons. Luke would go low, diving into the teeth of the ground fire to burn the balloons. It was a division of labor that required absolute trust. Wehner had to hold off the enemy fighters, often outnumbered, while Luke flew a straight, predictable line into the flak. The campaign began in earnest on September 12th during the Saint-Mihiel offensive. Luke claimed his first balloon near Marieulles. The sight of the massive fireball illuminating the evening sky was a revelation to the American ground troops. It was a visible sign that the enemy was being blinded. Over the next few days, the Luke Wehner team became a terrifyingly efficient machine. On September 14th, another balloon. On September 15th, 2 more. The physical toll of these missions was extreme. The SPAD XIII required immense physical strength to maneuver at high speeds. The cockpit was open, exposing the pilot to the freezing slipstream, the roar of the engine, and the smell of castor oil and cordite. Upon landing, Luke would often be so exhausted he had to be helped from the aircraft. His plane would be riddled with shrapnel holes, the fabric hanging in strips. Yet, fueled by a manic energy and the validation of his kills, he would order the plane patched and refueled immediately. This period of balloon busting was not just a series of victories. It was a systematic dismantling of the German observation network in the American sector. But the German response was inevitable. They reinforced the balloon defenses, added more fighter cover, and moved the balloons further back. The trap was closing, and the statistical probability of survival was dropping with every mission. The span of time from September 12th to September 29th, 1918, is often referred to in aviation history as the 13 days, a period of violence that remains unrivaled in intensity. It was during this fortnight that Luke earned the moniker the Arizona Balloon Buster, but it was also the period that cost him his only friend and his sanity. The climax of the partnership came on September 18th. It was a day that illustrated the brutal efficiency of the German trap. Luke and Wehner took off in the late afternoon to attack balloons near L'Abbeville. The German Defensive Command had prepared a reception committee. As the two SPADs approached the target area, a flight of Fokker D-50s dropped from the clouds. Wehner, adhering to his role as the protector, engaged the enemy fighters. He dove into the formation, drawing their fire and attention away from Luke. While Wehner fought a desperate dogfight against superior numbers, Luke prosecuted his attack on the balloons. He dove through the flaming onions, his Vickers guns hammering out incendiary rounds. The first balloon exploded. He pulled up, banked hard, and attacked the second. It, too, erupted in flames. Elated, Luke turned to find his wingman. The sky was empty of friendly aircraft. He saw a column of black smoke rising from the ground near the trenches. Joseph Wehner had been shot down, falling in flames under the guns of Lieutenant Georg von Hantelmann, a German ace. The realization that Wehner was dead triggered a psychological break in Luke. The rational response for a pilot low on fuel and ammunition would have been to retreat. Instead, Luke went berserk. He turned his SPAD toward the German lines, searching for targets. He spotted a formation of German fighters and attacked them head-on, a suicidal maneuver. In a blur of deflection shooting and aggression, he shot down 2 Fokker Dulhursts. Still not satisfied, he hunted down a Halberstadt observation plane and destroyed it as well. In a single sortie, Frank Luke had destroyed 2 balloons and 3 aircraft. 5 victories in less than an hour. It was a feat of destruction that stunned the air service. But when he landed at a forward French field, his fuel tank dry, there was no celebration. He was distraught. The loss of Wehner removed the only human connection he had to the war. He felt that the squadron's failure to provide more support had killed his friend. Following September 18th, Luke's behavior shifted from rebellious to nihilistic. He flew with a cold, grim determination. He was no longer fighting for medals or recognition. He was fighting to burn the world down. He racked up victory after victory, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's score to become the leading American ace of the war at that time. The 13 days were characterized by frenetic pace. Luke flew daily, sometimes twice a day. His aircraft was constantly being repaired. He was living on the edge of nervous collapse. The pilots of the 27th Aero Squadron watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. He was a dead man walking, a ghost who returned to the mess hall only to eat and sleep before going back to the slaughter. The tactical situation on the ground was shifting. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest battle in American history, was grinding forward. The demand for balloon kills was higher than ever. Luke, despite his insubordination, was the only weapon the air service had that could reliably blind the enemy. This created a paradox. The commanders needed him in the air, but they could not control him on the ground. In the wake of Wehner's death, Frank Luke became a rogue element within the American military structure. His grief manifested as a complete rejection of military discipline. He began to operate almost entirely independently of the 27th Aero Squadron. Luke frequently went AWOL, absent without official leave. He would take off on a patrol, destroy a target, and then, claiming engine trouble, land at a French aerodrome instead of returning to Rembercourt. He spent his nights with the pilots of Escadrille SPA III, the famous Cigonis, storks. The French pilots, veterans of 4 years of trench warfare, welcomed Luke. They did not care about his lack of social grace or his friction with American officers. They recognized a kindred spirit, a wild boar of the skies. In the mess of the Cigonis, Luke found a temporary sanctuary. He drank coffee with men like René Fonck, the Allied ace of aces. Though Fonck was often aloof, the unit culture was welcoming. They respected his balloon-busting prowess, acknowledging it as the most dangerous job on the front. This fraternization with the French and his disappearances fueled the paranoia back at the 27th Squadron. The old whispers about German spies resurfaced. Though Wehner was dead, the stigma attached to Luke remained. Captain Grant, infuriated by Luke's refusal to follow orders, began building a case for court-martial. He viewed Luke's independent operations not as heroism, but as a dangerous breakdown of command and control. On September 26th, Luke returned to the squadron after a brief leave, but the respite had done nothing to cool his temper. He flew the next day, scoring another victory. On September 28th, he took off without authorization and destroyed a balloon in the Betheniville region. Again, he did not return to base, landing instead at the Cigognes airfield to spend the night. When he finally returned to Rembercourt on the morning of September 29th, the confrontation with Grant was inevitable. The squadron commander had reached his limit. He did not care that Luke was the leading ace of the American Army. He saw only an officer who refused to submit to authority. The grounding order was issued. Luke was stripped of his flight status. This period reveals the deep flaw in the military bureaucracy of 1918. It possessed a weapon of singular effectiveness in Luke, but it lacked the flexibility to manage him. Luke was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was a gladiator. The constraints of the uniform chafed him raw. As he stood on the airfield on September 29th, grounded and under arrest, the psychological pressure was immense. He was being denied the only thing that gave his life meaning, the ability to avenge Wehner and destroy the enemy. The decision to flee to Verdun and appeal to Major Hartney was a desperate gamble. It was the act of a man who had burned his bridges and was now looking for a way to burn the rest of the map. He knew that by taking off against orders, he was effectively ending his military career. If he survived the mission, he would likely face a prison sentence. But survival, by this point, was likely not his primary objective. We return to the cockpit of Frank Luke's SPAD XIII, 6:58 p.m., September 29, 1918. The note had been dropped. The challenge had been issued. Frank Luke crossed the Meuse River into German airspace, a solitary speck against the darkening eastern sky. The German defensive network, alerted by his approach, roared to life. The sky ahead was a kaleidoscope of lethal geometry, black flak bursts, green strings of flaming onions, and the white tracers of machine gun fire. He spotted his first target near the village of Breyer's Farm. It was a Draken hanging low, its crew frantically trying to winch it down. Luke did not hesitate. He pushed the SPAD into a steep dive, ignoring the shuddering of the airframe. The ground fire intensified, a wall of noise and light. He held his trigger down. The Vickers guns spat their incendiary streams. The balloon's fabric ripped, the hydrogen ignited, and a massive fireball erupted, illuminating the countryside. One down. He banked hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, and turned toward the second balloon near the Meuse. By now, the element of surprise was gone. The German gunners had his range. Bullets tore through the wings of his SPAD, shredding the linen. He flew through the barrage, a moth diving into a furnace. He closed to within 50 yards of the second balloon and fired. It, too, exploded in a catastrophic release of energy. 2 down. But the trap had sprung. High above, the German fighter cover, 8 Fokker-Diens, rolled over and dove on the lone American. Luke was now fighting in 3 dimensions. dodging the ground fire from below and the fighters from above. Yet he saw the third balloon near the village of Mervaux. It was the final target of his promise. He maneuvered the crippled SPAD toward the third balloon. The Fokkers were on his tail, their Spandau machine guns chattering. Luke ignored them. He focused entirely on the gas bag ahead. He fired his remaining ammunition. The third balloon burst into flames. 3 balloons in less than 10 minutes. He had done the impossible. But as he pulled away from the third kill, a single bullet, likely from a machine gun position on a hill overlooking the valley, found its mark. It punched through the fuselage and struck Luke in the right shoulder, traversing his chest. The wound was mortal. Blood filled the cockpit. His strength failed. The SPAD, losing power and control, descended toward the fields west of Mervaux. The aircraft bounced across the uneven ground and came to a halt near a stream. The silence that followed the roar of the engine was deafening. German infantry from the village began to advance toward the wreck, weapons raised, calling for surrender. What happened in those final moments is shrouded in controversy, illuminated only by the affidavits of French villagers who watched from their windows. Some accounts claim that before crashing, Luke strafed a column of German troops in the village street, killing 6 soldiers, a final defiant act of war. Others suggest he crawled from the wreckage, drew his AP Fiore's caliber Colt model 1911 pistol, and fired at the approaching Germans until he collapsed. The Mervaux affidavits, signed by villagers like Léon Henry and Auguste Cuny in 1919, testify to his refusal to surrender. They state that he held the Germans at bay until he died of his wounds. While some historians debate the accuracy of these accounts, suggesting the villagers may have embellished to honor the American hero, the core truth remains. Frank Luke did not surrender. He died as he had lived, fighting. The Germans, respecting his bravery, buried him in the village cemetery. For months, his grave was marked simply as Unknown American Aviator. It was only after the war that the grave was identified, and the full magnitude of his final flight was revealed. Frank Luke Jr. was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His final tally of 18 victories in just 10 sorties remains a record of efficiency that defies belief. He was 21 years old. He was a difficult, arrogant, and reckless man who found his purpose in the fire of the Western Front. He was the Arizona Balloon Buster, and on that September evening he burned his name into history with a brilliance that time has not dimmed.